On the morning of August the 6th, 1945, President Harry Truman was aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, halfway across the Atlantic, waiting for a cable that would tell him whether the weapon had worked. He was 61 years old, a former artillery captain from Missouri who had been thrust into the presidency only 4 months earlier after the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt in Warm Springs, Georgia. Truman had inherited a war, a Manhattan Project he had not been briefed on until he took the oath of office, and a decision that no man in history had ever been asked to make. Now, aboard the Augusta, somewhere in the North Atlantic, sailing home from the Potsdam Conference in occupied Germany, he was waiting for a piece of paper to tell him whether the world had changed. Half a world away, in a telegraph office in Tokyo, a young operator noticed that a line from Hiroshima had gone quiet at exactly 16 minutes past 8. He tapped the key. Nothing. He rerouted through the regional relay station in Osaka, then through Fukuoka, then through the naval station at Kuri. All routes came back empty. Hiroshima, a city of 350,000 people, home to the 2nd General Army Headquarters and one of the largest military supply depots in western Japan, had simply stopped transmitting. The operator logged the failure. He escalated it up the chain. It was standard procedure. He did not know that 80,000 human beings had ceased to exist between the 3rd and the 4th second of the day. He did not know that at that same minute, a mushroom cloud was rising above the Ota River Delta, climbing higher every second. He did not know that the fireball beneath it had reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. He did not know that the light of the flash had been visible to fishermen 60 kilometers away in the inland sea, who had looked up from their nets and thought for a moment that a second sun had risen over the western horizon. He knew only that a line had gone quiet. He did not know that the war had 6 days left to run. And he did not know that for the next 192 hours, the men who ran his country would know exactly what had happened to Hiroshima and would refuse to say it out loud. This is the story of those 8 days, the days between the flash and the broadcast, the days when the truth arrived in Tokyo and the truth waited. In Japan in the summer of 1945, silence from a city was not unusual. For 6 months, American bombers had been erasing the maps of the empire. Curtis LeMay had ordered his B-29 squadrons stripped of their armor and their machine gun turrets, filled instead with jellied gasoline, and sent low over the wooden neighborhoods of the home islands. LeMay was a cigar-chewing Ohio-born general who did not believe in half measures. He had decided, in the winter of 1945, that the precision daylight bombing his crews had been trained for was not working over Japan, and that the answer was to burn the cities down at night from low altitude with incendiaries. On the night of March 9th, in a single raid on Tokyo that his crews called Operation Meeting House, 100,000 people had burned to death in a single night. The temperature at the center of the firestorm had reached nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt the metal fittings on the roofs of the houses and to boil the paint off the sides of fire engines. People who jumped into the canals to escape the flames drowned when the water heated around them. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, each city had taken its turn in the fire. By August, 67 Japanese cities had been targeted by area firebombing. The word for a bombing raid, kushu, no longer carried any special weight in conversation. It was weather, it was routine. Hiroshima had been spared, and the staff officers at Imperial General Headquarters had noticed. Some of them had begun to whisper that the city was being saved for something. They did not know what. There was a rumor that circulated in Hiroshima that summer, a nervous rumor of the kind civilians pass along when they are trying not to look at something. The rumor was that Hiroshima had been spared because so many of its former residents had emigrated to America and Hawaii before the war, and their relatives on the mainland had spoken up for the city. It was of course not true, but people repeated it because it was the only story available that let them sleep at night. They were about to find out why the city had really been spared. They just did not know it yet. At Imperial General Headquarters that morning, the duty officer noted the communication blackout in the log. He assumed a conventional raid. Perhaps a large one. He did not yet call for confirmation. He was following the institutional preference that had shaped every wartime protocol for the past 18 months. Wait, Verify. Do not speak until you know. He would wait a long time. To understand what was about to happen, and to understand why it would take so many days for the men in Tokyo to admit what they already knew, you have to understand who was in the room. At the top sat Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, 77 years old, a retired admiral, a man who had already lived through his own assassination once. On the 26th of February 1936, a group of young army officers had broken into his home in the pre-dawn dark and pumped 4 bullets into his body, 1 in the forehead, 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the chest, and 1 in the groin. His wife Taka had thrown herself over him and asked the officers if they were going to finish him, at least to let her deliver the final shot herself. The officer in charge, a captain named Ando Teruzo, looked at the wounded admiral bleeding on the tatami mat, ordered his men to salute, and left the room without firing again. Suzuki had survived, quietly, over months of convalescence. The bullet in his forehead had lodged in the frontal bone and been extracted by surgeons at the Naval Medical College. The bullet in his chest had passed within a centimeter of his heart. He had returned to public life nearly a decade later, a very old man with a scar on his forehead that his colleagues learned not to look at directly, and had taken the office of Prime Minister on the 7th of April 1945, at the moment his country was collapsing. He understood the young officers of the Imperial Army better than any man alive. He had felt them, personally, in the small dark hours of a February morning 9 years earlier. He understood what they would do if the war ended in a way they could not accept. Beside him sat Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo. 62 years old, a career diplomat, he had been born Park Mudeok into a family of Korean potters whose ancestors had been brought to Japan as prisoners of war during the 16th century invasions of the peninsula. The family had been granted samurai status generations later and had adopted the Japanese surname Togo, but everyone in the officer corps knew the origin, and it had made him permanently suspect in the eyes of the army. He had served as ambassador to Berlin and to Moscow. He had signed off reluctantly on the note that opened the war with the United States in December of 1941. He believed, as of that morning, in August of 1945, that the war was already lost. He had believed it for months. He was waiting for someone in the room to say it out loud. Across from him sat Korichika Anami, 58 years old. War Minister, a general who wore the uniform of the Imperial Army the way other men wore their own skin. He had been a schoolboy champion of Kyudo, the discipline of Japanese archery, and he had carried that quiet ceremonial physicality into every position he held. He believed in a final battle on the home islands. He believed that if Japan could bleed the Americans hard enough on the beaches of Kyushu, terms could still be negotiated. He believed the soul of the nation was not something that could be surrendered by paperwork. He was going to lose this argument. He would not live to see the day. Beside these three sat Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai for the Navy, General Yoshijiro Umezu for the Army General Staff, and Admiral Soimu Toyoda for the Naval's General Staff. Together the 6 men formed the Supreme War Council. The Japanese press called them the Big Six. 3 of them, Suzuki, Togo, Yonai, quietly favored exploring surrender. 3 of them, Anami, Umezu, Toyoda, would not move. The council was designed structurally to produce paralysis. Any single member could block a decision by refusing to sign. Any single ministry could bring down the government by withdrawing its minister. It was a system that had been built in the Meiji Constitution of 1889 to prevent any one faction from seizing the state. In the summer of 1945, it produced exactly what its designers had feared: total institutional gridlock at the exact moment when the state most needed to move. There is one more man to introduce before the story begins. 54 years old, working alone in the ruins of a laboratory in northwestern Tokyo. His name was Yoshio Nishina. He was Japan's most senior nuclear physicist. He had studied under Ernest Rutherford at Cambridge in the early 1920s. He had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen for 6 years after that, becoming so close to Bohr that Bohr's own children called him uncle. He was a quiet man, thin, with round glasses, who spoke English and Danish and German fluently, and who had spent the previous 4 years leading a program he did not talk about in public. The program was called NIGO. Its purpose was to build an atomic bomb for the Empire of Japan. Nishina had been given the assignment by the Imperial Japanese Army in April of 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. He had assembled a team of physicists at the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research, which everyone in Tokyo simply called Riken. They had built a small cyclotron. They had tried to enrich uranium using thermal diffusion, then centrifuge, then gaseous diffusion. Each method had failed at industrial scale. In April of 1945, an American B-29 incendiary raid had struck the Riken buildings and destroyed most of the research equipment. In June, Nishina had walked into a meeting of army officers and told them, calmly, in the level voice of a man reading a scientific paper, that Japan could not build the weapon in time. The uranium could not be obtained. The industrial capacity was gone. The war would be over before the bomb was finished. The officers had accepted his conclusion. He had gone back to what remained of his laboratory and returned to teaching quantum mechanics to a diminishing group of students. He did not yet know that within 24 hours a car would arrive to take him to a briefing he would never forget. He did not yet know that within 48 hours he would be standing in the ashes of a city, holding a piece of scorched roof tile in his hand and understanding, before anyone else in Japan, exactly what had happened. He did not yet know that he would spend the flight south, debating whether he should take his own life when he arrived. That morning he was drinking tea, now cut backward, 7 hours earlier, 2:45 in the morning, an airstrip on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. A B-29 bomber sat at the end of the runway, its 4 Wright R-335D duplex cyclone engines idling. On its nose, a name had been painted the day before in fresh block letters. Enola Gay, the name of the pilot's mother. The pilot had asked for permission to name the aircraft the previous evening. His mother, Enola Gay Tibbetts, was a school teacher in Miami. He had chosen her name over his father's because, he later said, she had been the one who supported his decision to leave medical school and become a pilot. The pilot was Colonel Paul Tibbetts, 30 years old. In the seat beside him sat co-pilot Robert Lewis. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Major Thomas Firby waited over the Norden bomb site, the top-secret instrument that could theoretically drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet. In the bomb bay, Weeperneer Captain William Parsons, a naval officer known throughout the crew as Deke, had spent the last several hours arming the weapon by hand, climbing into the bomb bay and inserting the cordite charges into the gun assembly at high altitude to reduce the risk of a runway accident. If the Enola Gay had crashed on takeoff with the weapon fully armed, it would have taken the entire island of Tinian with it. Parsons had asked to arm it in the air himself. His request had been granted. In the bomb bay behind Tibbetts hung a single weapon, 10 feet long, nearly 10,000 pounds, a gun-type uranium device that the scientists at Los Alamos called Little Boy. It had never been detonated before. There had been no full-scale test. The physicists were confident the design would work. It was the very simplicity of the gun-type mechanism, one piece of uranium fired down a barrel into another, that had persuaded them to skip a full-scale test. They had used their only test bomb, a plutonium implosion device, in the New Mexico desert 3 weeks earlier. That test, code-named Trinity, had produced a fireball so bright that a blind woman 150 miles away had seen the light of it. The uranium bomb, they believed, did not need one. Tibbetts released the brakes. The Enola Gay rolled down the runway at Tinian, using nearly every foot of it, and lifted into the dark over the Pacific. By the time the sun rose, the aircraft was over the coast of Shikoku, climbing toward its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. A weather plane ahead of it, one of 3, that had flown ahead to check conditions over the 3 possible targets, radioed back a single coded message. Clear skies over the primary target. Hiroshima would burn under a cloudless morning. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, local time, Ferriby released the weapon. 43 seconds later, it detonated 900 feet above a courtyard next to Shima Hospital in central Hiroshima. The intended aiming point had been the T-shaped Ayu Bridge, a short distance away. Ferriby had missed by roughly 250 meters, but for a weapon of that yield, the difference was invisible. At 16 minutes past 8, in a telegraph office in Tokyo, an operator noticed a line had gone quiet. The first reports began to arrive within the hour. They came in fragments from small railway stations at the edges of the destruction zone, from the Kaitaichi Rail Control Center a few kilometers outside the city, from the relay antenna of the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. Each report described the same thing in different words: a single blinding flash, a wave of pressure, then silence, then fire. The staff officers at Imperial General Headquarters gathered around a map table and began to consider possibilities. Their training gave them 3 categories to work with. The first was an incendiary cluster drop, large formation of B-29s dumping firebombs simultaneously over the central districts, the way they had done to Tokyo in March. But the survivors were describing only 1 aircraft, perhaps 2, not a formation, and no siren had sounded across the city warning of a mass raid. The second was a fuel-air explosive, a weapon the German scientists had been rumored to be developing, a device that would ignite a cloud of vaporized fuel in the atmosphere to produce a massive overpressure. But the burn patterns described in the fragmentary reports did not match. Fuel-air weapons scorched. This had erased. The third was a conventional device of unprecedented size. A single, enormous bomb dropped from high altitude, but no bomb of that scale had ever been built. No aircraft in existence could carry one. None of the 3 explanations fit. The staff officers looked at each other across the map table. They understood, at the level of professional intuition, that something was wrong with their categories. They also understood, at the level of professional self-preservation, that admitting this out loud in the presence of War Minister Anami would not be welcomed. There was a 4th possibility, one none of them named. Some of them had read the same American physics journals that Foreign Minister Togo had read. Some of them knew what Nishina had been working on until June. Some of them, therefore, already suspected what had happened to Hiroshima. They did not say so. By mid-morning a decision was made. A young officer of the General Staff was ordered to board an aircraft, fly to Hiroshima, land if possible, survey the damage, and report back with reliable information for the command. He went to the airport. He took off toward the southwest. Imperial General Headquarters issued no public statement. There was nothing to say yet. Or rather, nothing they were prepared to say. The habit was old, and it was institutional, and it had been shaped by 18 months of managing the morale of a starving nation under sustained attack. Wait for confirmation. Do not release information you have not verified. Control the language before you release it into the world. It was the habit of a military bureaucracy that had learned to be careful with words. It was also the habit of a military bureaucracy that had learned to hide things. That habit was about to meet an event it could not manage. Half a world away, aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta in the North Atlantic, President Harry Truman had just sat down to lunch with the crew when a messenger handed him a decoded cable. He read it, then he read it again. The message was from Secretary of War Henry Stimson, 2 lines long. Big bomb dropped on Hiroshima August 5 at 7:15 p.m. Washington time. First reports indicate complete success, which was even more conspicuous than earlier test. Truman stood up. He walked from the officers' mess out to where the enlisted sailors were eating. He was carrying the cable in his hand. He raised his voice, in the plain flat accent of a man from Independence, Missouri, and he told the crew that this was the greatest thing in history. Then he shook hands with the men closest to him. Then he sat down and finished his meal. 16 hours later, his voice would be broadcast to the world. In Tokyo, the silence from Hiroshima was still holding. The young staff officer's aircraft was still in the air. Yoshio Nishina was still drinking tea. And in the Prime Minister's residence, an old admiral who had once survived 4 bullets from young officers of the Imperial Army was preparing for a normal day of meetings, unaware that within 4 days he would be the man who broke 2,600 years of imperial protocol by asking his emperor to speak. The clock in the telegraph office read 8:42. The war had 6 more days to run. The staff officer's aircraft climbed southwest out of Tokyo through a clean summer sky. He was young. His name is not recorded in any surviving document from the day. He was a captain, or a major, or possibly a lieutenant colonel, and he had been handed the assignment because he happened to be available, and because the General Staff wanted eyes on Hiroshima before night. He carried a notebook, a pencil, and a set of standard damage assessment forms with printed categories for structural loss, casualty estimates, and residual military capacity. None of those forms would be usable by the time he landed. His flight took roughly 3 hours. Somewhere near the 90-mile mark, still well outside the inland sea, he and his pilot saw the smoke column for the first time. It was not a smoke column the way military men understood the term. It was a wall. It rose vertically to an altitude they could not measure, spreading at the top into a shape neither of them had ever seen in any weather book or any bombing report. From the cockpit, the pilot said aloud, to no one in particular, that it looked like the head of a great mushroom. The pilot brought the aircraft in lower and began a wide circling approach. The staff officer looked down. He was trained to look at cities. He had studied the damage patterns of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya after the great fire raids of the spring. He knew what a burned city looked like. He knew the blocks of blackened chimneys standing over grey ash, the roads still visible as pale scars through the ruins, the water tanks, and the factory foundations that always survived. What he saw beneath him now was not a burned city. It was a flat plain. The blocks were gone. The streets were gone. In the central districts, out to what he estimated as 2 kilometers from the point of detonation, there was nothing standing at all. Not a wall, not a chimney, not a tree. Beyond that boundary, buildings existed in various stages of collapse, and beyond that, fires were still burning through the outer wards. He could see the fires from 6,000 feet, thin lines of orange moving through the grey. He tried to identify Hiroshima Castle, which had stood in the center of the city for 350 years. He could not find it. He tried to identify the 2nd General Army Headquarters building, which he had visited 2 years earlier. He could not find that either. The pilot could not land. The airfield south of the city was intact, but the smoke was still too thick, and there was no way to know what the ground crew situation looked like. The staff officer transmitted what he could observe by radio in short broken phrases, and the aircraft turned back toward Tokyo. His report reached Imperial General Headquarters in the early evening. It contained 3 findings: total destruction in the central area, casualties in the tens of thousands at a minimum, likely much higher, cause undetermined but consistent with no known conventional weapon. The staff officers read the report in silence. They were experienced men. Most of them had served on the continent. They had seen the aftermath of artillery bombardments, of siege operations, of the great firebombing of Tokyo 5 months earlier when 100,000 people had died in a single night. They understood destruction as a professional matter. They did not understand this. War Minister Anami received the report at his residence. He was 58 years old, a general who had spent his career in the field, and he read the document the way he read all documents, slowly, with a steady hand, looking for what was there and what was missing. He set it down. He asked for the young officer to be brought in for a verbal briefing. He did not challenge the findings. He did not deny the destruction, but he made a decision that evening about language, and that decision would shape every public statement to come. At his direction, Imperial General Headquarters released a communiqué to the press wire services on the evening of the 6th of August. It stated that Hiroshima had been attacked by a small number of B-29 bombers using a new type of bomb. Damage was described as considerable. Investigation was ongoing. Details would follow. The words were, in their own way, technically accurate. A small number of aircraft had attacked. A new type of bomb had been used. Damage was considerable. The communiqué did not use the word atomic. It did not describe the extent of destruction the young officer had just observed from the air. It did not say that the 2nd General Army Headquarters, the command post responsible for the defense of all of Western Japan, had ceased to function. It did not say that a field marshal of the empire was presumed dead. It did not say that the city had been erased. It said that a new type of bomb had been used, and it said nothing more. Anami went home that night and slept. 16 hours after the detonation, a different voice began speaking to the world. President Truman had recorded a statement aboard the Augusta and released it through the White House press office. It was picked up by Allied radio, by BBC transmitters, by shortwave stations across the Pacific, and by Japanese monitoring stations in Tokyo, Osaka, and Fukuoka. Truman spoke plainly. He named the weapon, atomic bomb. He described its power, the energy of more than 20,000 tons of TNT released by a single device dropped by a single aircraft. He identified the target. Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base, he named the source of the American breakthrough, the largest scientific gamble in history. He called it, and we won. And then he made a promise. If Japan did not now accept the terms offered at Potsdam, the rain of ruin from the air, he said, would continue. There would be more bombs, there would be more cities. The translated transcript reached the Japanese Foreign Ministry and the Army General Staff before dawn on the 7th of August. Foreign Minister Togo read it in his study. He was 62 years old, a career diplomat, and he had been watching the war die by inches for 2 years. He read the transcript twice. He did not need a scientist to interpret it. He had read the American physics journals of the late 1930s, when the discovery of nuclear fission had been announced from Berlin, from Copenhagen, from Cambridge. He knew what fission meant. He knew that Truman was not bluffing, because bluffing at this level of specificity would be suicidal. No president would name a weapon and describe its yield in front of the world unless he had the weapon and knew he could use it again. He also knew what it meant that Truman had said, more of them, not one bomb. An inventory. Togo requested an immediate meeting with Prime Minister Suzuki that same morning. At the same hour, in a different part of Tokyo, War Minister Anami received his own copy of the Truman transcript. His response was recorded in the notes of his aides. He did not dispute that something extraordinary had occurred. He said, in effect, that one weapon did not change the strategic calculation. Japan still held its home islands. The American invasion force, estimated at more than 1 million men, was still weeks away. The plan for the decisive battle in the homeland, code-named Operation Ketsugo, was still viable. The army had prepared to inflict such casualties on the Kyushu beaches that the Americans would negotiate rather than continue. He ordered the army's own scientific staff to determine, independently, whether the weapon was in fact atomic. He did not that morning change a single word of the official communiqué. The gap between what had been said publicly and what was now known privately had opened. It would not close for 8 days. While an army waited for his scientists, the young staff officer, who had circled the city from 6,000 feet, was reboarding an aircraft on the morning of the 7th of August. This time he would land. The airfield south of Hiroshima was intact but chaotic. He got out, secured ground transport with difficulty, and moved toward the outskirts of the destruction zone. Within an hour, he was walking through streets that were no longer streets. The city had a smell he had no vocabulary for. It was not the smell of a burned city. He had smelled burned cities. It was something older, something that reminded him of a butcher's shop in July, mixed with the harsh chemical bite of scorched cloth and melted glass. He put a handkerchief over his mouth. It did not help. The wooden houses of the central districts had been reduced to a fine grey ash that shifted when he walked through it. The tram lines lay twisted in the road, melted into strange curves that looked almost decorative, as if a bored blacksmith had bent them for practice. Bridges still stood, some of them, but their approaches had been blasted away, so that stone arches ended in empty air over the river. The Ota River itself was carrying bodies. Some of them were floating. Some were caught in the reeds along the banks. Some were the bodies of children. Many of the bodies were nude, their clothing having been either burned away in the initial thermal flash or removed later by survivors looking for anything that was not on fire. Survivors moved through the ruins in a slow, uneven current, looking for people. Many of them were burned in patterns the young officer could not initially understand. The burns followed the lines of the clothing they had been wearing at 8:15. Where the fabric had been dark, the skin had absorbed the thermal pulse and cooked. Where the fabric had been white, the skin was largely untouched. He saw a woman whose kimono pattern had been printed onto her back in raised scars, the fine floral design of the fabric transferred to her flesh like a tattoo. She was walking. She did not appear to be in pain. She appeared to be looking for something. He found the 2nd General Army Headquarters, or what was left of it. The compound had been located in the grounds of Hiroshima Castle, less than a kilometer from the hypercenter. Nothing above ground remained. The stones of the castle wall had been thrown outward in a starburst pattern. Where the command building had stood, there was a shallow depression. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata, 66 years old, had survived by an accident of geography. He had been outside the main building at the moment of detonation, at the edge of the castle grounds, taking his morning constitutional along a path that faced away from the hypercenter. The stone lantern he had been walking past had shielded him from the worst of the thermal flash. Most of his staff had not been so shielded. His senior intelligence officer, Colonel Kumao Imamoto, was alive but severely burned. The chief of staff of the 2nd General Army was dead. The chief of operations was dead. Most of the communications section was dead. Also dead in the wreckage of the headquarters was a Korean prince named Yi Yu, 32 years old, a lieutenant colonel serving on Hata's general staff. He was a grandson of Emperor Gojong, the founding monarch of the Korean Empire, whose throne had been abolished when Japan annexed Korea in 1910. Yi Yu had been educated at Japanese military academies from the age of 12. He had spoken Japanese at home. He had married a Japanese woman. He had been riding a horse near the castle when the bomb detonated. The horse had been vaporized. Yi Yu had been thrown, badly burned but alive, into a rice field. He died the following day in a field hospital at the naval base in Hiroshima, across the bay. The young officer noted these details in his book. He was still trying to write in the standard format, casualty estimates, structural loss, residual military capacity, but his handwriting had begun to change on the page. The letters were smaller, the lines ran together. He was seeing more than the forms could hold. He returned to Tokyo on the morning of the 8th of August with a second report. At Imperial General Headquarters, that report was read alongside a rising pile of survivor accounts, regional messages, and telegrams from prefectural officials who had begun to understand what had happened to the city next door. The picture at the command level was now unambiguous. Hiroshima had not been damaged. It had not been heavily struck. It had been erased. The public communique did not change. Follow-up statements on the 7th and 8th of August acknowledged enormous damage without naming the weapon. Meanwhile, Truman's broadcast was being repeated on shortwave. The phrase atomic bomb was in global circulation. Japanese citizens with access to foreign radio were hearing it in English, and then, within hours, hearing it translated by Domain News Service correspondents who had picked it up from the same broadcasts. In Tokyo neighborhoods, in the countryside outside Kyoto, on remote islands, ordinary people were beginning to piece together what had happened from foreign voices they were technically forbidden to listen to. The information architecture that controlled domestic knowledge in wartime Japan was quite suddenly obsolete. The Americans were broadcasting the truth to anyone with a receiver. It was into this collapsing information environment that Yoshio Nishina walked on the morning of the 7th of August, when the car finally came for him. He was 54 years old. He had been drinking tea when the summons arrived. He had listened to a young army officer explain that his presence was required immediately at a briefing at Imperial General Headquarters. He had put on his coat. At the briefing he was shown the Truman transcript. He read it once. He asked to read it again. He set it down on the table and looked at the officers in the room. There were perhaps a dozen of them. Some of them he knew. He had presented his research to some of them personally in previous years, in the same building, in similar rooms. Then, in his soft, careful voice, the voice of a man who had lectured on quantum mechanics in 3 languages, he said the thing that no one else in the Japanese government was yet willing to say. The Americans had built it. The Americans had actually built it. He was ordered to lead a scientific team to Hiroshima to confirm his own words with physical evidence. Lieutenant General Seizo Arizuwa, 56 years old, chief of the intelligence department at Imperial General Headquarters, would command the overall investigation. Nishina would lead the scientific side. They tried to leave that afternoon. The transport aircraft assigned to them broke down before takeoff. A part had failed. There was no replacement immediately available. The trip was postponed until the following morning. Nishina went home that night to his laboratory in northwestern Tokyo. He did not sleep. He sat with a small group of his senior researchers, all of them men who had worked with him on the NIGO project, the abandoned Japanese atomic bomb program. He told them what he had read in the Truman transcript. He told them what he expected to find in Hiroshima. Then he told them something else. He said that if the Americans had built the weapon, and if he confirmed it when he landed the next day, he was considering taking his own life. not out of shame at Japan's defeat, out of shame at his own profession. He and his colleagues had failed to build what the enemy had built. They had told the army it was impossible with the resources available, and it had not been impossible, it had been done. And a city was gone because it had been done. His colleagues talked him out of the immediate decision. They asked him to wait until he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. They pointed out that if he took his life before the investigation was complete, he could not tell the government what had happened, and the war might continue on the strength of misinformation. He agreed. It was, they later said, the kind of argument he could not refuse. He was a scientist. Evidence was not optional. He boarded the aircraft on the morning of the 8th of August. The flight took several hours. As they approached the inland sea, Nishina looked out the small window at the countryside sliding past below. He was already composing the report he would write. He was already, in his mind, running through the physical measurements he would need to take. Soil samples for uranium daughter products, water samples for radioactive contamination, photographic film from the ruins of hospitals and photoshops, film that would have been exposed by gamma radiation even inside sealed containers, film that would show him whether the weapon had been a fission device or something else. He needed the film especially. Film was the honest witness. Film did not care about politics or national morale or the reputations of the men in the cabinet. Film either showed the fogging pattern of gamma exposure or it did not. The aircraft banked and began its descent. Below him, the plain of Hiroshima opened out. Nishina saw the smoke that had been rising for 2 days. He saw the flat grey expanse where the central districts had been. He saw the shape of the destruction radiating outward from a single point. He did not need the soil samples anymore. He did not need the film. He knew at the moment his eyes registered the pattern, before the aircraft had even touched the runway, exactly what had happened to the city. He landed. He walked out into the ash. He bent down in what had once been a residential street and picked up a piece of scorched roof tile, the kind of black glazed tile that had covered the wooden houses of Hiroshima for generations. The glaze on its surface had been vaporized by the thermal pulse, leaving behind a rough grey face he could rub with his thumb. He turned the tile over in his hand for a long moment, then he put it in his coat pocket. He walked further into the ruins. He located the hypercenter by triangulating the direction in which the shadows of destroyed buildings had been thrown outward. He picked up soil samples. He collected fragments of granite from a bridge parapet that had been fused into strange glassy shapes by the heat. He entered the ruins of a photography shop and found a sealed metal canister of unexposed film. When he opened it later that night at his temporary quarters, the film was fogged from edge to edge in a pattern he had seen before in laboratory experiments when film was exposed to gamma radiation. He wired his preliminary conclusion back to Tokyo the same day. Uranium fission device. Enemy source confirmed. The wire arrived at the cabinet office in the late afternoon of the 8th of August. Anami read it. He read it again. His scientists had told him what he needed to know. He did not change his position. That evening, the full cabinet met for the first time to discuss the Hiroshima weapon at the level of the entire government. Togo pressed hard. The Potsdam Declaration, which the cabinet had publicly dismissed 12 days earlier through Suzuki's ambiguous use of the word mukusatsu, must now be reconsidered. The atomic bomb was not a rumor and not an American propaganda claim. It was confirmed by Japan's own senior physicist, whose loyalty and expertise no one in the room could reasonably question. There would be more of them. Truman had said so. The war could no longer be prolonged in the hope of negotiating better terms. Anami answered him with the argument he had been preparing since the 6th of August. One weapon, however destructive, did not change the fundamental military equation. The home islands were still defended, the invasion force was still weeks away, the plan for the decisive battle was still viable. Surrendering now on the basis of a single weapon of unknown quantity would give up the only leverage Japan had left, which was the willingness of its soldiers and its civilians to die on the beaches. Prime Minister Suzuki did not force a resolution. The cabinet adjourned without a decision. The Big Six were deadlocked, 3 against 3, on the same lines they had held since May. That night, at 11 in the evening Tokyo time, the Soviet ambassador Yakov Malik presented Foreign Minister Togo with a declaration of war. The ambassador handed him a single sheet of paper. He read it. He asked quietly whether the ambassador understood what this meant for the people of Japan. The ambassador said that he did. He bowed. He left. Soviet forces crossed the border into Manchuria at 1 in the morning. Over 1.5 million troops, 28,000 pieces of artillery, 5,000 aircraft. The Kwantung Army, Japan's largest remaining field force, began to collapse within hours along a front that stretched hundreds of miles from the Amur River to the Mongolian steppes. The news reached the cabinet in the early morning of the 9th of August. At 2 minutes past 11 that same morning, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, released a plutonium implosion device over the city of Nagasaki. The primary target had been Kokura, a city of 200,000 on the northern coast of Kyushu. Kokura had been obscured by smoke from a firebombing raid the previous night. Sweeney had circled 3 times, burning fuel he did not have, and had finally diverted to the secondary target. Nagasaki had also been partly obscured by cloud. A brief opening had appeared. The bombardier had used it. 40,000 people died in the first hour. The estimate would rise, over the following weeks, to somewhere between 60 and 80,000. The Big Six were meeting when the news arrived. The room went quiet. A staff officer entered and handed a note to Prime Minister Suzuki. Suzuki read it. He passed it to Togo. Togo passed it to Anami. Anami read the note. He did not speak. His argument that the Americans had only one weapon had lasted 3 days. Now there were 2 dead cities, an invasion in the north, and a room full of old men who had run out of arguments. And still, when the meeting resumed, Anami said that the war must go on. There was one route left. It ran through the emperor. Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Koichi Kido had been watching the cabinet fail for 3 days. He was 56 years old, small in build, careful in manner, and closer to Emperor Hirohito than any other living man outside the imperial family. His office was in the palace itself. He had spent the morning of the 9th of August moving between rooms, gathering fragments of news, listening to the reports coming in from the general staff. He had read the wire from Nishina. He had read the first casualty estimates from Nagasaki. He had watched the messengers arrive with the news from Manchuria. By late morning he had reached a conclusion. The Big Six would not resolve themselves. They had been given every reason in the world to move, and they had not moved. The structure of the council would keep them in place, 3 against 3, while the country burned around them. There was only one mechanism left in the Japanese constitution that could break the deadlock. An imperial conference, a direct session in the presence of the emperor, a room in which the emperor, if he chose to speak, could not be overruled by the military. Kido drafted the proposal that afternoon. He walked it to the Prime Minister's residence and presented it to Suzuki personally. Suzuki read it. He was 77 years old and he had been waiting for someone to give him this exact document for 2 months. He signed it. The conference was called for late that night. The Big Six assembled in an underground air raid shelter beneath the Imperial Library, in a small room lit by a few bare bulbs, at a long wooden table covered with a white cloth. It was just before midnight on the 9th of August. The air was thick with humidity and cigarette smoke. Emperor Hirohito entered the room at 11:50 and took his seat at the head of the table. He was 44 years old. He wore the uniform of the Grand Marshal of the Imperial Forces, a simple field khaki without ornament. He carried himself, as he always did, with the slight stoop of a man who had spent his youth studying marine biology and who had never quite been comfortable in military dress. He said nothing at first. He listened. Prime Minister Suzuki opened the session by summarizing the situation: 2 atomic bombs. A Soviet declaration of war, the collapse of the Kwantung Army, the Potsdam Declaration still on the table with one condition of Japanese concern, the preservation of the emperor's sovereign status. Then he called on the members to speak. Togo spoke first for acceptance. He was calm. He had been preparing the argument since the 7th of August. Japan should accept the Potsdam terms with the single condition that the imperial institution be preserved. Admiral Yonai supported him. Then Anami spoke. His voice was not raised. He was not a man who raised his voice. He argued once more for continued resistance. He argued that the honor of the army required a final battle on the home islands. He argued that surrender without that battle would break the moral spine of the nation for 100 years. He said 4 conditions had to be attached to any acceptance: preservation of the imperial system, self-disarmament by Japanese forces, no occupation of the home islands, prosecution of war criminals by Japanese courts, not foreign ones. Umezu supported him. Toyoda supported him. 3 against 3. The clock in the shelter passed midnight. It passed 1 in the morning. It passed 2. The room could not resolve itself. At 2:30 on the morning of the 10th of August, Prime Minister Suzuki did something no Prime Minister of Japan had done in the history of the modern imperial system. He rose from his seat. He turned to face the Emperor. He said, in a voice that shook slightly, that the Council could not reach a decision, and that he had come to beg the Emperor for guidance. Every man in the room understood what had just happened. In 2,600 years of imperial tradition, the Emperor did not participate in political decisions. He was above politics. He reigned. He did not rule. To ask him to break a deadlock was to ask him to enter the machinery of government in a way that had no precedent since the founding of the state. It was, in constitutional terms, an act on the edge of what the system permitted. It was, in practical terms, the only move left on the board. Suzuki had just asked him. The room waited. Emperor Hirohito lifted his head. His voice, when he spoke, was small and slightly high. Those who had been in his presence often described him as a hesitant speaker. He did not hesitate that morning. He said that he had thought about the matter carefully. He said that he could no longer bear to see his people suffer. He said that continuing the war would mean the annihilation of the nation and the death of countless more civilians. He said that he had been shown the reports on the damage at Hiroshima. He said that the time had come to bear the unbearable and to accept the Potsdam terms. He did not use the word surrender. He did not need to. He said one more thing before he stood. He said that he was aware some in the army would find this decision unacceptable. He asked those present to accept the burden of persuading them. Then he left the room. An army sat at the table without moving for a long moment after the Emperor was gone. When he stood, he walked out without speaking to any of the other members. He went home. He did not go to bed. He began to draft, in careful vertical characters, on a piece of white paper, a personal letter he would leave behind on the morning of the 15th of August. The decision of the 10th of August did not end the war. It began a diplomatic process that would take 5 more days. Japan's conditional acceptance of the Potsdam terms was transmitted through the Swiss and Swedish legations that same morning. The single condition was the preservation of the Emperor's status. The message went from Tokyo to Bern to Washington. It arrived at the State Department at 7:40 in the morning on the 10th of August. The Allied reply arrived on the 11th of August. It was drafted by Secretary of State James Burns and approved by Truman and by Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. It stated that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor to rule would be subject to the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. He would remain on the throne. He would not be removed, but he would take instructions from an American general. It was not the clean guarantee the army had wanted. It was enough. Suzuki, Togo, and Yonai believed it was enough. Anami, Umezu, and Toyoda did not. The cabinet met again on the 12th of August and again on the 13th, and each time the same 3 men argued that the Allied reply was too vague, that the Emperor's position was not truly guaranteed, that the phrase "subject to" raised the possibility of the Emperor being tried as a war criminal, and that the war must continue until stronger guarantees could be obtained. On the 14th of August, a second imperial conference was called. The Emperor spoke again. He said the same things he had said 4 days earlier, in the same careful voice. He said that further delay would only mean more Japanese dead. He said that he wished to broadcast a rescript to his people accepting the terms. He asked those present to draft the language and to prepare the recording. That afternoon, in a small studio in the Imperial Household Ministry building, a phonograph engineer named Nobukata Nagatomo recorded Emperor Hirohito reading the imperial rescript accepting the Potsdam Declaration. The Emperor had never before had his voice recorded for public broadcast. His speech patterns were formal and archaic, the classical court Japanese that only educated aristocrats and priests could easily follow. The first recording was judged inadequate. A second was made. 2 acetate discs of each were cut. They were sealed in metal cases. They were carried by a chamberlain named Yoshihiro Tokugawa, a direct descendant of the last shogun of Japan, to a small office in the Empress's chambers, where they were hidden in a safe beneath a pile of unrelated documents. The chamberlain locked the safe. He went to bed. He did not know that a group of officers at the War Ministry had spent the previous 72 hours preparing to prevent that recording from ever being broadcast. Their leader was Major Kenji Hatanaka. He was 33 years old. He served in the military affairs section of the War Ministry. He was intelligent, exhausted, and increasingly untethered from the chain of command. He had graduated from the Army Academy at the top of his class. He had been decorated for service in Manchuria. He had spent the previous 2 nights trying to convince Anami to lead a coup against the surrender decision. Anami had refused to say either yes or no. Hatanaka had taken the refusal as sufficient permission. His conspirators included Lieutenant Colonel Gojo Shiizaki, Lieutenant Colonel Masataka Ida, and a small circle of junior officers who had lost the ability to imagine a Japan that laid down its arms while an enemy still stood. They knew about the recording. They did not know where it was. Their plan was straightforward and, in its way, exact. Seize the Imperial Palace. Place the Emperor under what they called protective custody, isolating him from the surrender faction. Find the recording. Destroy it, then broadcast their own message to the nation, calling for the war to continue, and hope that the Eastern District Army would rise in support once the fait accompli was in place. At approximately 1 in the morning on the 15th of August, they moved. Hatanaka and Shiizaki went to the headquarters of the 1st Imperial Guards Division. They confronted its commander, Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, 51 years old, and demanded that he order his troops to seize the palace grounds. Mori refused. He asked them to leave. He said he would need to consult with the Eastern District Army before considering such an order. He said that the Emperor's decision had been made, and that his duty as a soldier was to honor it. Hatanaka shot him. He shot him in his own office, in front of witnesses, with his own service pistol. A colleague of Hatanaka's, Captain Shigetaro Uehara of the Air Academy, finished the killing with a sword. They took Mori's official seal from his desk. They used it to forge Strategic Order No. 584, an authentic-looking directive from the dead general to his own troops, ordering them to seal off the Imperial Palace from the outside. The Imperial Guards obeyed. They did not know Mori was dead. They sealed the palace. Hatanaka and his men entered. For the next 8 hours they searched the compound. They cut telephone lines. They rounded up palace staff. They opened cabinets and desks and interrogated servants at gunpoint. They knew the recording existed. They knew it was somewhere inside the walls they now controlled. They did not find it. The recording sat in the safe in the Empress's chambers, under a pile of paper, in a room the searchers walked past twice without opening. A palace chamberlain named Yasuhide Toda had specifically directed searchers away from the room by telling them, with a straight face, that the room contained only women's clothing. By 5 in the morning, the situation had begun to collapse. The Eastern District Army, whose support the coup absolutely required, refused to move. Its commander, General Shizuichi Tanaka, drove to the palace himself at first light. He arrived in his staff car. He walked through the gates. He confronted the mutineers directly. He ordered the guards to stand down. The guards, discovering that Mori was dead and that the orders they had followed were forgeries, complied. Hatanaka and Shiizaki left the palace on foot as the sun rose. They stopped at NHK Radio and demanded 10 minutes of airtime to explain their case to the nation. They were refused. They spent the last hours of their lives distributing leaflets on the streets of central Tokyo, walking through neighborhoods where ordinary people were preparing for the noon broadcast, handing pieces of paper to strangers who did not read them. Just before 11 in the morning, on the plaza in front of the Imperial Palace, in view of the Nijubashi Bridge, Kenji Hatanaka and Jiro Shiizaki took their own lives. Hatanaka shot himself in the forehead. Shiizaki cut his stomach with a short sword, then shot himself in the head as well. They fell within a few meters of each other on the gravel. They died within sight of the palace gates they had to fail to hold. At almost the same moment, in his residence a few kilometers away, War Minister Korichika Anami had finished his letter. He knelt on the floor of his study, facing the Imperial Palace, wearing a white kimono. He drew his short sword. He performed the ritual of seppuku with the deliberate slowness of a man who had been preparing for it for 4 days. His brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takeshita, was present as a witness and at the appropriate moment offered to complete the act with a killing stroke. An army waved him off. He wanted, he said, to die by his own hand entirely. He bled to death slowly over several minutes on the tatami of his own home. His letter, found beside him, apologized to the emperor for his great crime. It did not specify which crime he meant. He did not retract his position on the war. He did not acknowledge that the army's assessment had failed. He offered his death in the old formula as an act of contrition. He was buried in the family plot in Oita Prefecture on the island of Kyushu, the island on which the American invasion he had spent his last months planning to defeat had been scheduled to land in November. He did not hear the broadcast. At noon, on the 15th of August, 1945, radios across Japan carried the voice of Emperor Hirohito for the first time in the history of the nation. He read the rescript. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. He did not use the word surrender. Even at the very end, he could not bring himself to say it. Across the country, people gathered around radios in factories, in offices, in the ruins of firebombed neighborhoods, in villages that had never been touched by the war. Many wept, some knelt. A great number could not understand the archaic court Japanese in which the rescript was written and had to have it explained to them afterward by others who could. It did not matter. The voice was the voice of the emperor, and the meaning of the voice was clear enough. The war was over. The 8 days between the flash over Hiroshima and the broadcast at noon had cost, at minimum, 150,000 human lives. The estimate for Hiroshima by the end of 1945 ranged from 90,000 to 166,000. The estimate for Nagasaki ranged from 60,000 to 80,000. Those numbers do not include the tens of thousands who would die in the following years from burns that would not heal, from cancers that would not be understood for a decade, from a form of injury that Yoshio Nishina himself would eventually die of in 1951, when the blotches that had appeared on his skin 4 months after his visits to Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally became the leukemia that killed him. He was 60 years old. He had spent the last 6 years of his life continuing to teach quantum mechanics to Japanese students, working at what remained of the Riken laboratory, and quietly refusing to speak in public about what he had seen in the ashes of Hiroshima. The War Diary of Imperial General Headquarters for the 6th of August, 1945, recorded the destruction of Hiroshima in 4 lines. It noted the communication loss. It noted a report of a large explosion. It noted the dispatch of an investigative officer. It did not name the weapon. It did not describe the scale of casualties. 4 lines for a city. Shigenori Togo was arrested by American occupation authorities in the autumn of 1945. He was tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convicted of crimes against peace, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died in July of 1950 at the age of 67 in Tokyo University Hospital, where he had been transferred from Sugamo prison for treatment. He was 4 years into his sentence. He was the man who had signed off on the note that opened the war with the United States, and he was the man who had, more than any other member of the cabinet, fought to end it. Koichi Kido was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was paroled in 1955. He lived until 1977, largely in silence, occasionally visited by scholars who wanted to ask him about the events of August 1945. He almost never spoke about them. Field Marshal Shunroku Hata, who had survived the destruction of his own headquarters by an accident of geography, was convicted of Class A war crimes and sentenced to life. He asked, in court, to be stripped of his rank as Field Marshal in atonement for the failures of the army he had served. The tribunal declined. He was paroled in 1955. He died in 1962, the last surviving Japanese officer to have held the rank of Gensui. Prime Minister Suzuki resigned on the 17th of August, 2 days after the broadcast. He lived quietly at his home in Chiba Prefecture for another 3 years. He died in April of 1948 at the age of 80 of natural causes. The scar on his forehead from the February morning in 1936 was still visible. The Enola Gay was flown from Tinian to storage in the United States after the war. It sat for decades in a warehouse in Suitland, Maryland, slowly rusting, before it was restored and put on public display. It sits today in the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Northern Virginia, its fuselage intact, its bomb bay intact, viewable from a walkway that runs alongside it. American families walk past it every day. Many of them stop. Many of them do not know what they are looking at. Colonel Paul Tibbets died in Columbus, Ohio in November of 2007 at the age of 92. He had asked that no headstone be placed on his grave so that anti-war protesters would have no site at which to gather. His ashes were scattered over the English Channel, where he had flown missions in the earlier part of the war. In Hiroshima, the Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, which had stood 160 meters from the point of detonation, was one of the very few structures anywhere near the hypercenter left partially standing. Its steel dome, twisted but recognizable, remains where it stood on the morning of the 6th of August, the city rebuilt around it. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996. It is called, in Japanese, the Genbaku Dome, the atomic bomb dome. Every year, on the 6th of August, at 8:15 in the morning, a bell rings in the Peace Memorial Park that surrounds the dome. The city goes quiet. School children stop what they are doing. Tourists lower their cameras. The sound of the bell travels across the rebuilt streets and the office towers and the bridges that were replaced after the war, and for 1 minute, once a year, the city stops. What those 8 days between the flash and the broadcast exposed was not a failure of intelligence. The reports arrived. The scientists confirmed. The information was in the room, in the hands of men who were qualified to understand it, within 72 hours of the detonation. What failed was not the arrival of the truth. What failed was the institutional willingness to let the truth produce a response. For 8 days, the men in Tokyo argued about what could be said out loud. For 8 days, the cities and their dead waited. That is what the record shows. That is what it will always show.